presenter this morning comes to us from Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. Dr. Matthew Muller is an associate professor of theology there. He earned his undergraduate degree at Benedictine and then went on to get a master's degree in Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis. I'm sure he's glad he's not in Minneapolis at the moment. And his doctoral degree in historical theology from St. Louis University. He then went back in among some in-between ministries, returned to Benedictine to be a teacher. He has a special research interest in St. Newman. His doctoral dissertation was about the thought and legacy, some aspect of the thought and legacy of St. Henry Newman. He has served on the board of directors for the St. John Henry Newman Association of America, and he is currently on the editorial board for the Newman Studies Journal. He contributed to what is called the application that was sent to Rome to promote and just, in a sense, present the justification for St. Newman being named a doctor of the church. Then it's no surprise that he was in Rome on December 1st for the celebration of the Eucharist when St. Newman was formally named the doctor of the church. So Dr. Muller is here this morning to share with us his perspective. You see the title on the agenda, A Doctor for Our Times, St. John Henry Newman's Enduring Legacy. Matthew.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. It's fun to be at a place dedicated to St. John Henry Newman, someone that has been a major part of my life for the last 15 years or so. And I'm always excited to go and talk about Newman at different places. My students, after like the end, we get towards the end of the semester, they realize like I'm kind of, we say a newmaniac, right? Kind of a nerd about this, and I'll kind of try to throw in Newman things every chance I get, and so they're kind of like, oh yeah, and so the extra credit questions at the end of the semester are like, who said this quote? And they just always put Newman down if they don't know, because they're like, it's probably from Newman. Yeah, I came to study Newman. Let's see if I can make it work. Which button should I use?
There you go.
Oh, did it? Thank you, guys. Okay, sorry. I'm a convert to the faith. So I went to Benedictine College in 2002. I went there to play basketball. I didn't know anything about Catholicism. My family went to church once in a while when I was a kid, but sports was kind of the religion. It's like sports. That's what it was all about. But I went to Benedictine, and I was open to kind of like, do I need God in my life? Like, does that even really matter? Can't I just be a good person? And I took a theology. Everyone is required to take Introduction to Theology, so I had that my first semester. And one of my professors assigned a reading by C.S. Lewis that was called Man or Rabbit. And I was like, well, that's an interesting title. But the first line of the essay says, do you need to believe in God to live a good life? And he said, that's the thing I've been asked to address. And I was like, oh my gosh, like that is literally the question I ask myself sometimes. Like, do I need this religion thing? Can't I just be a good person? And C.S. Lewis said in this essay, he said, well, you're asking the wrong question. He's like, you should be asking, is it true? Like, is Christianity true? Is it true that God exists? And then he goes on to say, because if it's true, then yes, you need it to live a good life. But if it's not true, then no, like you shouldn't follow it. You shouldn't want to live a lie. You want to live the truth, because human beings are made intellectual to seek and live what is true and real. And I was like, oh, this is so helpful. This is a helpful thing for just a way for me to think through it. And I had not read John Henry Newman at that time. I don't think I read John Henry Newman for a long time, but Newman had a similar kind of commitment to truth in his life that led him on this journey that eventually led him into the Catholic Church, becoming a saint, now a doctor of the church. But he was committed to the truth. And I see like kind of my first kind of steps towards becoming Catholic was in similar like kind of to Newman's kind of commitment to truth and trying to seek that. Another thing that was kind of similar to my own conversion was in this intro to theology class, it came very clear to me. It was just a sort of, I don't know, there's a sense of this makes sense. that if God is going to send his Son into the world to redeem us, he would also provide some sort of way that people who live 2,000 years after that event could know that that happened and what Christ taught and what Christ was about. And so it made sense to me that there would be a church or an institution or some kind of thing that continued throughout history that would be the kind of communication and guarantor of that revelation. And that's a thought Newman had too as well as a young man. He's like, well, there needs to be a church, right? There needs to be this. And so I was open to the church. The big thing for me was, do I want to live this way? Like, will I actually commit my life to live what Christ is calling us to live? And that took a little longer. And that, I will finally get back to the slide that's up here. Because Newman chose as his motto this Latin phrase, cor ad cor loquitur, which means heart speaks to heart. And for Newman, so much of the way he taught the faith and handed on the way he lived it was through relationship and a kind of showing of the truth. Not just telling the truth, but showing it and living it. And that was a thing that took a little longer for me, but helped me eventually fully decide to enter the church, was through friendship and the witness of faithful Catholics who I found more joy when I was with them. I found a greater sense of purpose, and it was through the living kind of holiness of other Catholics on campus at Benedictine that finally made me say, I want to do this. I want to be Catholic. And so I feel like even though I didn't know who he was, I had this kind of experience that was very similar to what Newman's spirituality and theology was all about. And then it wasn't in graduate school when I finally started reading Newman and seeing why so many people would talk about this person. And though he's difficult to read at times, he's Victorian. There's a lot of commas, semicolons. It just keeps going and going. It's, as I tell my students, it's worth the effort because he's so insightful for our times and so good at understanding kind of the human person, our own minds, the way we think. He seems to be a master of this. So just a little bit about him. So he lives in this age, the 19th century, of incredible transformation, the beginnings of kind of in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, but so many interesting technologies and things are developed in his lifetime. As he says, he arrived at Oxford on a stagecoach and he left on a steam engine. And so just the transformation that takes place in that idea of horseback to locomotives. Right? The beginnings of modern medicine, and then some of the big intellectual ideas, whether it's political philosophy changes, Darwin's theory of evolution, so many different things we can kind of point to. And he lived through this time, and I think one of the things why he's become so helpful to the church over the course of the years is that he's on the forefront of this wave, and maybe he doesn't answer every single question, but he gives us a guide of how we should navigate a world that is in flux and in change. So big part of his life is as an educator and a pastor. He goes to Oxford University as a student and then becomes a fellow of Oriel College, which is a very kind of prestigious college at Oxford University, probably the most intellectually serious and famous of the time. Then he becomes a tutor, so he's sort of a mentor, literally a teacher of undergraduates at Oxford, and became the vicar of the university church, so he was a pastor. So educating and being a pastor is kind of throughout his entire life, whether it's as a young man in his 20s or into his 80s as a Catholic in Birmingham. In 1845, he converts to Catholicism, and this was a decision that was is a sign of his holiness and why he was named a saint, because he was one of the most famous men in England. His books would fly off the shelves. He had income, he had social reputation, he had friends, and choosing to become Catholic in England was like a betrayal of your country. And so to take that step was a step into the unknown and definitely a step away from comfort. And so he follows the truth to that point where he will enter the Catholic Church, and he goes to Rome, goes to a very brief kind of seminary experience of theological studies, is ordained a Catholic priest, and then comes back to England and starts the Oratory in Birmingham, which is founded after St. Philip Neri's religious community, the Oratorians. And from there, the oratorians have spread throughout England since his time, into more in the United States. Other kind of important works, he starts the first Catholic university in Ireland, and we'll come back to some of his writings on that, from that experience. But launching this university, he then gives us this great gift of a book called The Idea of a University, and many other writings on education that have continued especially to influence American Catholic higher education. And more, the people in England are like, you Americans are so great. You have Newman centers everywhere. He's like, no one here cares anymore. It's like, no, we care, right? We're taking this on. And then in 1864, he wrote probably one of his, an important work for his own life, which was the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which is a defense. Apologia means to make a defense. And he's defending his life against accusations that he was dishonest, that he was ultimately like a liar, that he was never really a true Anglican. He was this kind of Catholic trying to undermine the Church of England, and that he never really believed any of the things he said. He was just doing this for deceitful reasons, something like that. So he writes this book, and it becomes one of these great defenses of Catholicism in England, and really kind of revives his career. He's eventually named a cardinal by Pope Leo XIII. So there's something very fitting, right, that Pope Leo XIII names Newman a cardinal. That really sort of solidifies his life's work and is a recognition of his importance. And now Pope Leo XIV is the one who names him a doctor of the church. So there's sort of like bookend to his life that the Leos have provided for Newmaniacs, right? And then, as I said, they're named a doctor. He was canonized by Pope Francis in 2019, and then named a doctor of the church in 2025. So a little bit of a rundown. There's a lot more we could go into, of course. But here's some of the kind of some big principles, or like I would say like big ideas, right? Big themes about his personality and characteristics of his life. And we saw this, and I'm going to show you again the meditation we did on. It's called the meditation on Hope in God, the Creator. But he had a great sense that God has a plan, and God is guiding all things. And he had a sense that this was going on, and in some ways that can in some ways sound like very impersonal, right? Like God has a plan, he's ordering the universe, he's working through all these different things, and so it seems like, well, geez, there's this big plan, and what do I have to do with it, right? There's this huge, vast plan God has, and I'm just one person, you know? But then he says, but the other side of his spirituality was that what I call a personalistic spirituality, that no, you actually do, there's a big plan, and you have an important role in it. Right? And that's what the meditation we did is about. And I think I give this to students kind of as an introduction to Newman, because I think this really speaks to young people today of the need, the desire for a life that has purpose and mission, but they also have a sense of this world is huge. We get a sense of it through social media so quickly, and it can be kind of almost overwhelming that the world is there's all these things going on, and we seem like so small. And Newman helps us to see that, yeah, we are small, right? But there's still like God has a plan for us in the place that he has put us. And so, don't you slide off. My water's trying to escape off the thing. But this is part of this is a little bit longer. The quotes up here from what we prayed this morning and meditated on. And there's some interesting paradoxes here, right? God was all complete, all blessed in himself. God doesn't need us in a sense, right? God's fine on his own. But it has been his will to bring about his purposes by the beings he has created, right? So even though God doesn't need us, he wants us, and he chooses us, and he has a plan for us. Okay? And we are created to his glory. We are created to do his will. I am created to do something or to be something for which no one else is created. So there's something that God wants us to do. But then the interesting thing for Newman in this meditation is, like, so there's something he has planned for us. But then we may not actually know what that is. We may not have an awareness of how God is using us. So as he goes on there, he says, whether I be rich or poor, despised or esteemed by man, God knows me and calls me by my name. There's something I'm supposed to do, even if it doesn't look like what I thought I was supposed to do. Right? So there's kind of a paradox there. And then this meditation goes on. Right? God has created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. Right? Somehow I am necessary for his purposes, as necessary in my place as an archangel in his. If indeed I fail, he can raise another, as he could make the stones children of Abraham. Right? So there's again that paradox of like, I'm really important, and I'm also not. Right? Like God has a plan for me, but someone else could do it. Right? And so there's this kind of, then it's a paradox of Christianity of both God knows us by our name, he knows us from the moment of our conception, and at the same time, like, I'm not that big a deal, right? So this is an important reminder for professors, I think especially. So I have a part in this great work. Right? I'm a link in a chain, a bond of connection between persons. He has not created me for naught. Right? There's a purpose to my life, and I'll do good work, I'll do his work, if I just keep his commandments and serve him in my calling. And this is that kind of personalistic spirituality that I think really connects with actually with all of us, right? But especially with young people, with college students. And Newman believed this about his own life, and I think he really showed he believed it in other people's lives as well, the people around him. I mentioned already the idea of him as an educator and a pastor. And really, education, I think, really, well, it's not me, it's other people have said this, that it informs everything that he did. All of his writings, kind of his whole philosophy, you can find sort of analogies to his life, his experience of being educated and his experience as an educator. And so there's kind of an interesting, I think, connection here. He wrote this sermon that was kind of like this event. It was like the sermon to kick off the academic year at the Catholic University of Ireland. The sermon is called Intellect, the Instrument of Religious Training. And in there, he made these comparisons. He said, it was the Feast of St. Monica. And he said, St. Monica is the famous mother of St. Augustine, and St. Augustine is the famous sinner saint, right? He committed his life to sin and lustful pursuits, and then had this great conversion. And Monica had been praying for him for so long that he would convert, and it took a long time, but he does. And Newman says, like, the university, or the church is like St. Monica, right? The church is a mother, and all the faithful are her children, and she prays for us, and she seeks our conversion through sacraments, through preaching, through grace, through all these great things. And so the church is like St. Monica, is a mother praying for her sons and daughters. Right? Then he goes from there. He says the university is a church. Right? He says is a mother, right? An alma mater. And like the church that prays for her students, he says the university has its own wayward flock of rascal students, right? And they are loved by their university in a similar way. And I just thought, okay, so yeah, he's making an analogy here between these three great kind of images of Monica, the church, and a university. And I think he actually then thinks of university education much in the way that, like, the church, he thinks the church exists in the world. And so, hopefully this makes sense up here. I'll try to make sense of this. All right, so on the one side, you have kind of education. And in Newman's mind, a fully kind of Catholic university would have these three components. You have the professors who are teaching in the classroom and forming the intellect. They are the communicators of knowledge, the handing on and imparting of knowledge. Then you have what he would call the college, or what they call at Oxford the college, which we might say like kind of residence life and student life, where the moral and spiritual formation of students takes place, where that knowledge in the classroom is integrated into their life. And we care about not just a grade, but them as a person. And the professors care about their students as persons too, but it's an imparting of knowledge, whereas in the college there's an imparting of kind of habits and character. And then Newman says, and then you have this third thing, which is the church. As a Catholic university, the church is present. And that can be through administration, that can be through sacraments and liturgy, that can be through kind of governance and different things. So like at Benedictine College, we have the monks at St. Benedict's Abbey and the Sisters of Mount St. Scholastica College on the board of directors, and we have relationships there and things like that. And that's his kind of idea of like what a Catholic university fully would be. in ecclesiology, he has a similar idea going on, where within the church as a whole, you have those in the church who kind of pursue faith-seeking understanding, or the intellectual life. We typically think of these as theologians, philosophers, academics, who defend the faith, explain the faith to those in the church and to the world outside. Then you have kind of the life of the church, which is worship and prayer, communal life, things that happen in a parish. Right? It's the pursuit of holiness and devotion. And that maps on similar to like the college. Okay? And then you have kind of the church's order. We've got a great big book called Canon Law. You've got your like missal of like the liturgy. We have all these different traditions and customs, and we have an authoritative kind of hierarchical structure of authority within the church. And all of these things work together to make the church what it is. Right? And so there's kind of an interesting way of, if we think of the church, what is its mission? Its mission is to educate. The church's mission exists to teach us about Christ, about salvation, about how to get there, right? And to awaken in us sort of a religious sense and a religious calling. And Newman thinks like if that's what the church is doing, the university does something very similar. Even if the student doesn't know that, right? Even they don't know that that's what they're here for. Then the last thing about his personality that I'll touch on is that one more clip. There we go. He did not call himself a theologian. He called himself a controversialist. And I thought this was kind of funny in reading his writings, because he's a doctor of the church now, right? But he was asked to go to the First Vatican Council that took place in 1870, and he didn't want to go. And in a letter he wrote to one of his friends, and he said, like, truly, I am not a theologian. He says, a theologian is one who has mastered theology. And he goes on to describe how the theologian can make all these distinctions and makes this great, like, kind of systematic work of religious doctrine. And he says, I don't really do that very well, right? This I am not, and never shall be. Right? Put me in official garb, and I am worth nothing. Really, nothing? I mean, come on, right? Being a little modest. But every now and then I shall, if you leave me to myself, every now and then I shall do something. And it's like, again, something that turns out to be one of the most unique things in the history of the church. But the idea here is when he would write these big works, or even if it was a small essay, he starts it by saying, people are confused about this, or this problem has arisen, and here is a solution. He was always worried about how can I help others understand the faith more, or help clarify something that's troubling to them. And so it goes back to that idea of being an educator and a pastor, that he always kind of wrote with a purpose of explaining and defending for others. And people would write to him whenever some kind of controversy came up. He'd get several letters. What do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And eventually he would say, I think I need to write something about this because my friends or my students or the people in my parish are confused. And so he would try to come to their help and come to their aid. Okay, which gets us to teaching and being a doctor. So when we give this title, Doctor of the Church, the word doctor is going to, we use it in modern contemporary America with a doctor of medicine, right? They help the body. You go to a hospital to find a doctor. But that Latin term, doctor, actually meant teacher. And so the professor is still called a doctor, not because they heal the body necessarily, because they teach. They've acquired an expertise in a certain area to teach. Right? What does it take to become a doctor of the church? Well, first you have to be a canonized saint. You have to be declared a saint in the church. Newman checked that box in 2019, right? Got that covered. You have to have sound teaching, right? And this would be part of also becoming a canonized saint in the sense of you haven't taught heresy, you haven't taught bad ideas, that your teachings, your writings have been consistent with the church's teachings throughout history. But then the third component is recognition of eminent doctrine, which is to say a recognition that this person's ideas have influenced the church long after their life. And so part of my role in the positio, in our application to the Vatican to name Newman a doctor of the church, was to make the case that in several different topics, Newman had an important legacy in the 20th and now the 21st century, especially his influence on the Second Vatican Council. And so that's the case we were trying to make to the Vatican in our writings. And thankfully, the reviewers, the theological reviewers, were unanimous in their approval of Newman being a doctor of the church. And so that was able to happen this last year, which was a great kind of blessing. I was telling Sister at dinner last night, it was, in some ways, it's very humbling because it's like, well, it's basically right time, right place, Muller. You know, like I happen to be alive at the right time and we'll study with the right people to get invited to, contribute to this positio. But there were people for the last 50 years, 75 years saying, Newman's going to be a saint and he should be a doctor of the church. And I'm talking about this for decades. And so it's really a culmination of many kind of generations of people who had studied his life and valued him. As a sign of his eminent doctrine, you have sort of every pope since Leo XIII really acknowledged Newman's holiness, right, and his importance in the life of the church. And then our previous 4 popes, counting our current one, all contributed to his elevation kind of in the ranks of the history of the church. Right? So John Paul II declared him venerable in 1991, and then Pope Benedict XVI declared him blessed, and then Francis declared him a saint, and now Leo XIV declares him a doctor of the church. So he really Newman has received the approval of the last 4 generations, you could say, of popes, which I think is just kind of confirms his importance and his significance. Then some of the part of having an eminent doctrine as well is that you have influenced others. And this is just a kind of a short list of people that have a touch point with Newman who were inspired by him. So Gerard Manley Hopkins is one of the great Catholic poets of the 19th century. J.R.R. Tolkien, the writer of Lord of the Rings, was educated at the oratory school that Newman founded. So Newman had passed away, but Newman's institution of the oratory and their school taught Tolkien and his siblings. The wave of Nouvelle Théologie theologians that are important in the Catholic intellectual life in the 20th century, many of them read Newman and were inspired by his kind of return to the church fathers. There's several others on here. Father Luigi Giussani, the founder of Communion Liberation, read Newman thoroughly in his seminary program, the Catholic Studies program, and of course Newman Centers and Newman University, right? Like the legacy of his doctrine carried out here, right? And so Newman's had a great kind of intellectual legacy, and this is just a little bit of it. Edith Stein, the great German philosopher and convert, who is now St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross, was another advocate of Newman and Newmaniac, we would say. Right? Where are we going? I click to ice. Yeah, no, perfect. Good. So if we're going to say, okay, how do we boil Newman's doctrines down to? Let me click one more. Okay, good. He had these 3 ideas. A sacramental principle, which is this idea that all of the world is like a sacrament, right? That nature and supernature are kind of mixed together, and that underneath the visible and material reality of the world, there is an invisible and spiritual reality taking place. It's a sense he had as an Anglican, as a young man, that this was the truth, and he carried it with him into Catholicism, and he saw that God works through the material, visible world, right, to affect his things, right, to affect his plans, which includes us at times. The dogmatic principle was the principle that there is religious truth, that we can know God, and that there are revealed truths that we can know, and that these should be taken seriously as real knowledge. This, again, kind of informs his whole life and his development of doctrine theory, which I'll talk about in a second. And the last one, I put an asterisk next to this because he doesn't use this phrase, but I think it fits in. It's called the integrative principle, which by that I mean whether he was preaching to his Oxford undergraduates or he was talking about education, he understood that all truth is ultimately one and harmonious, as we were talking earlier, and all of reality ultimately comes from God and has its ultimate purpose in God, and so everything can be united and linked together, whether that's in ourselves, so that our mind and our hearts and our emotions are all united towards what is true, good, and beautiful, or when we look at like the arguments between physicists and theologians or astronomers and philosophers or whatever it is, that ultimately the truth fits together, and that we should trust in that and seek to integrate things into our lives. So with those kinds of principles, I'm going to close by kind of going through a few problems of modernity, because the title of it is Newman is a Doctor for Our Times. And so he can teach us things that we are still dealing with, that he dealt with, and that we still have to deal with today. And those kind of three big ideas are the problem of history and change, that we are much part of being modern people is a recognition that there is history and that it changes, right? And that there were things that once were and they come to be, and then things that were go out of existence, right? And there's this kind of process, and sometimes that can be bewildering and can be difficult. The problem of faith and doubt. So the idea here is that religious truth is not, there isn't really religious truth. There's only a few things you can be certain about, and everything else is just kind of something to be your opinion or a feeling, or maybe just you just be agnostic about it, right? That's the idea of doubt. And then the last idea I want to talk about is kind of compartmentalization and fragmentation, which I see as one of the kind of challenges we deal with in the university. So, problem one, history and change. Newman was dealing with this problem. Or put it this way, how can Christianity be true if Christianity changes? If the truth was given by God in divine revelation, then wouldn't it just be the same all the time? And if it's changed, then how do we know where the true Christianity is? Right? If it changes, then is it lost forever in 70 A.D. right after with the apostles? How do we know where Christianity is anymore? And this was a big kind of intellectual challenge of the 19th century. And the way Newman thought of it was, well, ideas develop. They have to. Any kind of what he called a living idea it takes time for that idea to fully unravel, you could say, or for us to fully understand what all is entailed in this idea. And so any big idea, whether it's Plato's philosophy or sort of political philosophy, whatever it could be, Newtonian physics, right? These ideas are put into the world, and then if they are big ideas, they're going to spread, and they're going to enter into the minds of people, and people will reflect on this, and they'll add to it, or they'll take away, or they'll modify it. And he says this is just the case in everything. So we should expect it to happen in something as big of idea as God and salvation. Right? We should expect that God gave us his revelation in Jesus Christ, and that was handed on to the apostles, and now it's handed on through generations and generations, and these ideas then grow and bear fruit and answer questions, and as things live in the world, developments should be expected, he's saying. But one of the things that will come with this is some sort of infallible teaching authority, some sort of institution founded by Christ to guide us and help us to know here's where authentic Christianity is. Right? And then Newman makes the case in his big book, The Essay on Development of Christian Doctrine, that this in fact has happened, and he points to many arguments from the history of the church. A couple of great quotes. You can't do Newman things without long quotes. So, it is indeed sometimes said that the stream is clearest near the spring. Right? So you get a little spring of water coming out of it. He says, whatever use may be made of this image, it does not apply to the history of a philosophy or a belief, which on the contrary is more equable and purer and stronger when its bed has become deep and broad and full. Right? So his idea, right? Imagine of this river flowing through and undulating through a scene, right? And then the stream is more itself, is clearest or it's at its best, right? When it has become deep and broad and full, and it navigates through terrain, sometimes cutting through it, sometimes moving around it. So his images of a flowing stream, not just go back to the source. It's not. He said that's not the right image we should use. And then he says a living idea changes with them. Them here is like the times, like history and the different kind of interactions with different ideas and things. It changes in order to remain the same. It changes in order to remain the same. To remain what it is, it's going to have to adapt to the world in which it is surrounded by. In a higher world, it is otherwise. Right? In heaven, he's thinking ideas like God is stable, the heavens are stable, but here below, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. Right? And this is, similar to in our own lives. Right? There's a spirituality there as well, that to be perfect is to change, right? Because we are not perfect now. Right? God wants to improve us, grow us in grace and virtue, and so even in our own lives. But he sees this as like part of the history of doctrine. To live is to change. So he gave us a couple of examples. And I think just to like give us a little bit of something. Okay, what do you mean by this? Right? Historically, two that he pointed that come up is the Catholic doctrine of purgatory. The word purgatory doesn't exist in the Bible, but also neither does Trinity and other terms. But Newman shows that, well, if you acknowledge the ideas of baptism and original sin and God's work of salvation and grace, then purgatory was something that was already there, already understood, like already kind of implicit in what Christ had taught. It just took time for that idea to become fully understood and then name it. Right? Had to put a name on that idea. So he would say like purgatory is one of these great examples of you don't see the word purgatory until the 6th century. St. Gregory the Great uses the term purgatory, but St. Augustine talks about it before that, and he's saying you have all of these little evidences that the idea was implicit and then it becomes explicit. The Immaculate Conception is defined in 1858, the idea of Mary conceived without sin. And then this idea was present in the church for centuries, but it just hadn't yet been defined. Right? And so so those are a couple examples, right? Contemporary things, I put an asterisk next to this because one of the criteria Newman would give for this is an authentic development is something he called chronic vigor. Means like this new idea persists for not just a couple years, not just on Twitter for 2 weeks, right? But like it goes from like generation and it hangs around, right? And the problem for our own time is if we wanted to say, oh, development of doctrine has happened this week, right? So, well, we need to wait and see how that goes, right? But there are certain things in the world today that challenge the church to answer new questions. And I put bioethics at the top of the list, right? Because the technologies that we are able to use in health and medicine provide great opportunity, but also can provide great peril. And the churches, like actively, Catholic theologians and ethicists, philosophers, Catholic medical ethicists, are like right now working on how do we think through some of these problems and how do we apply the church's tradition to a problem that never was even conceivable to people in the 1800s or the 1500s or 100 AD, right? And that's kind of how like Newman saw like development would take place. There's been development on the Catholic doctrine of the death penalty that from John Paul II through and then Pope Francis on kind of the applicability and the use of the death penalty and its impermissibility or its inadmissibility, as Catechism says now, and ideas of salvation, of whether there's a lot of questions related to salvation that when we understand human psychology more, the necessity of human freedom or the way in which human freedom is taken away from people, then we have a different understanding of how or who is eligible, you might say, for salvation. Right? For I think an example of this that we could look at is morally, ethically, something like suicide has always been considered a mortal sin for centuries. But as we come to understand human psychology in a much more robust way, we start to realize that suicide is not something people choose. Right? It's often something that is a result of it's a tragedy and a result of something that isn't working correctly in us. Right? And the church has recognized that, and so that has then kind of softened, you might say, the way in which we handle situations like that, those tragedies take place. Right? And these are just contemporary things that are coming up in our world that Newman gives us a guide to help understand that this isn't corruption of Catholicism. This is authentic development in light of growth. All right. Problem 2. The problem of faith and doubt. Right? Especially the new atheists, if you ever read some of the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens. These were very popular writers in the late 90s, early 2000s. And their whole idea was like, religion is basically for stupid people, right? It's the opium of the masses. It keeps them distracted, but you got to be pretty ignorant to believe religious ideas. And they're not the first group to say that, but that was a very kind of popular mindset of that group. And they were carrying on, I would say, a kind of an intellectual tradition from the Enlightenment that basically said faith is irrational, and the only way that we can come to know truth is through empiricism or scientific demonstration. If you can't put it in a lab and test it, you can't know it. Or if you can't give me a mathematical proof for it, it's not knowledge, it's feeling, it's sentiment, it's opinion, it's something like that. And Newman was, I think this is like a specific challenge it's a big challenge for a lot of different things, and Newman set about trying to confront this. But as we connect it to kind of our work of university education, especially if it's like working with undergraduates, they're often told that their mission and purpose in life, their identity is within themselves. They find it and define it for themselves, which is putting a great challenge upon their shoulders that like you define your life for yourself. Right? But on top of that, then if they're also told knowledge is only things you can prove under a lab or under a mathematical calculation, there's this whole area of life where they have to make decisions that they can't have that level of certainty on. And so there's often, I think, a hesitancy for them to make a commitment to a major or to a vocation or whatever it might be, what their summer break plans, whatever, because they're afraid, what if I make the wrong decision? And I can't prove it, I can't prove which one is right, and they get stuck. And so I think even Newman's kind of way of thinking through faith and doubt is really helpful to our students. Because what he's going to say is that faith is ultimately unavoidable. Belief is essentially imperative, right? We cannot live without it. We make judgments upon belief all the time, every day. And I like to use like silly things with my students on this, like, do you really know that your mom is your mom? And what the heck is he talking about? Right? But it's like, well, what proof do you have that your mother is truly your mother? And it's like, well, we look similar. Okay, well, like lots of people look similar. Right? There's lots of doppelgangers out there. And you say, well, I have a birth certificate. It's like, well, how do you know you weren't switched at the hospital? And I point out to like when babies are born, the baby gets like the little bracelet or the anklet, and the mom gets the bracelet and the anklet, and they're scanning these things every time the baby comes in and out. That freaked me out as a first-time dad. I was like, wait, why are you doing this? Like, well, we don't want to mix up the babies. Oh my gosh, right? You could do that, So I just like to press them on this idea because it's like ultimately they have to trust, right? And they trust and they're reasonable to believe that their mom is their mom, right? It's not irrational. And it would actually be irrational of them to call up their mom, like, hey, Nancy, so I'm not going to call you mom anymore because I don't really know if you're my mom. But once I prove it, I'll call you mom again. But for now, you're just going to be Nancy, right? Like that would be cruel, in some ways, right? So Newman kind of talked. He doesn't use that example. He's more polished than I am. But he's saying faith has got to be rooted in judgments, and it's necessary for our action in life. Human beings are made to believe and to have faith. And so he has this long quote, but where the heart is commonly reached not through reason, but through the imagination. And then it goes on and says, persons influence us, voices melt us, looks subdue us, deeds inflame us. Many a man will live and die upon a dogma, no man will be a martyr for a conclusion. Right? The conclusion is but an opinion. It is not a thing which is, but which we are certain about. To say that a thing must be is to admit that it may not be. No one, I say, will die for his own calculations. He dies for realities. And then in the same essay, he goes on to say, life is not long enough for a religion of inferences. We shall never have done beginning if we determine begin with proof. Resolve to believe nothing, and you must prove your proofs and analyze your elements. All of our actions, so much of our thinking, even in our own disciplines, begins with some kind of judgment about this is valid, this is invalid, right? And then we go from there, right? But I love the line, life is for action, right? Life is for action. If we insist on proofs for everything, we shall never come to action. To act, you must assume, and that assumption is faith. Right? So he really challenges to say, like, it's okay to not be certain from mathematics or science. There's other means of judgment, right? And that is that idea of like persons influencing us, voices melting us, looks subdue us. There's other ways of reasoning that are rational, and we depend on these in our life for our big decisions, especially things like careers and spouses and summer breaks and whatever else it might be, right? Basketball coach, who are you going to put in the game? Who's the starting five? Well, there's not like a mathematical theorem you can use here, but you got to make the judgment. Right? Okay, and the last one, and then we'll wind it up here, is the problem of compartmentalization. Okay? A disintegrated, fragmented life that occurs both like kind of spiritually or morally in our own lives, where Newman was really good at calling out his students on making compromises in their moral life, that they'll be good here but not here, right? And like, Lord, I'll give you a little bit of this but not everything, right? And he would kind of find those little things and pull on them. But then also intellectual fragmentation, what he called being a man or person of one idea, where we study one thing, and then that one thing becomes the way in which I think about everything. Right? So the idea being, right, like in the eyes of the hammer, the whole world's a nail. Right? So if I don't have a hammer, I hit everything really hard with it. Right? But sometimes a little finesse might be needed. Right? And so Newman's saying the problem he saw in education especially education, was kind of a siloed or becoming a person of one idea. Or we study all these different things. Like we're covered in information, whether it's from our classes or from social media and the news, and we don't have the power to integrate it all. So we look at the world as a tapestry, but from the wrong side. Right? So we just see a bunch of strands. But you have to get to the other side of the tapestry to see the beautiful image. And often, if we're not trained in this kind of philosophical habit of mind, we won't be able to do that. Right? He says we need to maintain the full circle of knowledge in our education. Right? That idea of a full circle of knowledge is this idea that all the disciplines need to be present. Right? If you drop any science out of the circle of knowledge, you cannot keep its place vacant. That science will be forgotten. Other sciences close up, or in other words, they exceed their proper bounds and intrude where they have no right. So his example is like, if you take theology, he's defending the place of theology because theology was being removed from universities. So he said, if you take theology out, eventually the other disciplines will start making claims about God, even though that's not really their area. The physicist will start making claims, or the astronomer will start making claims about God, or the psychologist will make claims about the soul, or something like that. But it does actually go the other way, and he's aware of this, that if you remove, say, biology, the theologians will start doing biology sometime. Like there's a temptation to fill in where disciplines are missing. And so we need the whole circle of knowledge, because ultimately truth is one. And we have a temptation because, as the quote on there says, we cannot do without a view, and we put up with an illusion when we cannot get a truth. Right? And so it's important to him that we have this capacity to study a wide range of subjects and then to integrate these things. And this is his description of the philosophical habit that I think is this idea of integrating. Right? The intellect that knows and thinks while it knows, that incorporates so that it cannot be partial, it cannot be exclusive, it cannot be impetuous. It is patient, collected, majestically calm, because it ever knows where it stands and how its path lies from one point to another. Right? That, I think, is such an important part of what we are striving for as educators today, for ourselves, but also for our students. When, as I've mentioned this multiple times, right, we're inundated with information, and the news cycle is fast, and the Twitterverse or the Instagram world, the TikTok world, informs so much of, or is like the way in which some people get information. And do they have the capacity to filter that, right? And discern, like, when am I being fed lies? And where is the truth found? And maybe things a little more nuanced than TikTok wants me to think, or my favorite podcaster wants me to think. And Newman's saying a true Catholic education that integrates allows us to discern that really well through this philosophical habit. And so the last thing, he's saying that in his university, he wants faith and the life of faith and the life of the intellect not to be set apart. Where you have on one side of the campus, that's where learning takes place. On the other side of the campus, That's where you can go pray your rosaries. Right? Instead, he says, no, we should have a full integration in ourselves. And he says this begins with the people. Okay? He says, I want the same roof to contain both the intellectual and the moral discipline. It will not satisfy me if religion is here and science there, and young men converse with science all day. And this is 1850s, right? So it's primarily just the dudes at the university there. But that young people converse with science all day and lodge with religion in the evening. I want the intellectual layman to be religious and the devout ecclesiastic to be intellectual. Sorry, that was the next slide there. And so this kind of uniting, how do we integrate these things? It begins with us in attempting to integrate our own lives, and then we're able to then model that, witness to that for our students in our various disciplines and our various roles that we play in forming students. And ultimately, this is, I think, what we can end with on Newman is, Pope Paul VI said, modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers, and if it does listen to witnesses, teachers, is because they are witnesses. And what we've done here with St. John Henry Newman is Francis gave us the confirmation of his witness, his holiness, and now we've been confirmed that he is a great teacher. And so he's a witness, but also he actually fulfills what Paul VI was calling to be a teacher. Thank you for your time.
I get a lot more blessings out of it. Really? Funny. Really, the new